Hi, welcome back to part two of this week's lecture on the Anthropocene. So, in this section, we're going to be talking about Romanticism and Sublime. I'll start again with another quote from Marcel Fiel from Fame magazine, the essay The Blue Marble. So he says here, at the point when nature itself value free and indifferent, has value attributed to it by human beings and starts to become part of our experience, perception, and history, it becomes a thing of cultural significance. Nature has become more than anything an idea and therefore culture. So, Romanticism, it may seem like a bit of a stretch, but why we are talking about it is because it's all about nature and what nature meant. And it's very important for understanding a lot of foundations in terms of landscape photography. So Romanticism originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century. It's also known as this period as the Romantic era. And it was a time of artistic, literary, music, and intellectual movement. So they emphasized emotion, individualism, as well as pastor nature. And it was partially a reaction to the Industrial Revolution at the time, but also scientific rationalization of nature and modernity. So the idea that realism was opposite to Romanticism. So, they have these sort of heroic elements and figures of Romanticism, and the artists and the individuals, were heroicized who raised the quality of society. So, in visual arts, it took a key form as landscape painting. And, a very notable image from this period is this one here by Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. And he's looking out to nature that is misty and, the waves of turbulent oceans and storms, which is emotional, and the colouring and the sort of this heroic figure gazing out into nature as the adventurer and this sort of hero. And like in Germany and in England, this was a key movement, as well as in general Europe. But key artists here were Friedrich and Turner, which some of you may know of as well. And there are other artists such as William Blake and many others. But in terms of this idea of Romanticism, what was also sort of looked within this was this the idea of the epic nature as an expression of the sublime. And sublime is a sort of philosophy term, and it was about is about the aesthetic qualities of greatness, whether it's physical, moral, intellectual, metaphysical, aesthetic, spiritual, artistic. So it's about like sublime in terms of greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement, or imitation. So we're going to see photographers who work with these notions of the sublime in the landscape. And we're going to jump to a very different period of time here with Ansel Adams, who was a landscape photographer and environmentalist known for his black and white images of the American West. And you can see here, it's a romantic, beautiful, the toning, the way it's photographed, is about evoking something by experiencing nature. So, it's this grand, highly detailed images, that come from his interest in the natural environment. And for him, they weren't about pure documents, but they were about reflecting the sublime experience of nature as a spiritual place. And his works showed a commitment to his interest in conservation, actually, with the increasing degradation of the American West that he was seeing during the 20th century. So art critic John Swarovski wrote that Ansel Adams attuned himself more precisely than any photographer before him to a visual understanding of the specific quality of the light that fell on a specific place at a specific moment. For Adams, the natural environment is not a fixed and solid sculpture, but an insubstantial image, as transient as the light that continually redefines it. This sensibility to the specificity specificity of light was a motive that forced Adams to develop his legendary photographic technique. And then we can see this photograph as well with the man looking over nature. And, he's on the edge of a rock looking over mountains. It's pretty heroic. And, the man is an adventurer in nature, and nature is an experience of emotion and sublime, but this sort of idea of the hero and the heroic. You can very much see that from that image, in 1818, to this one here, at a much different time, and then if we're going to sort of more contemporary artists who are working at this idea of the sublime, we can look at Chris McCall. So this is, a calculated long exposure of the sun made with paper negatives. So he often creates this sort of custom-made large format cameras where he forces the sun to physically burn a trace, and we'll see more detailed about this, of its arc into each photograph. So here we can see the arc of this trace of the sun. So here it says double midnight, so you can see sunburn, and it's Arctic Circle, Alaska. So it's the idea of the artist and photographer as an adventurer. He's going to the Arctic Circle and Alaska to photograph this, and the experience that this image creates. So it's an articulate exposure of the sun over different horizons, formed in these arcs depending on the camera's location, on the planet and the time of year. And he uses these large format silver gelatin printing paper. And the idea is that each photograph is more or less a realistic photograph landscape. It creates a landscape itself that from these solar negatives with skies that have been burned directly by the sun. But at the same time, it's not what you expect. These are marks made by the sun, not outlines of mountains or hills. And you can see videos of this as well on his website, which I've included the link down the bottom as well as at the end of all three parts of the lecture. He talks about his practice here. I thought it was quite interesting in terms of thinking about how artists, these contemporary photographers, think about the sublime. This project has transformed the way I think about photography in the world. Not only do I find myself using photographic materials in ways I hadn't imagined, but I've also had to negotiate the physical realities of my subject as I've never had to before. Having no control of the placement and movement of the sun, I've had to instead move myself and my equipment to specific locations at specific times of the year in order to capture the compositions I wanted. So these are sort of different, him capturing the tide. But it's this idea of man, the human, sort of capturing nature and this experience they have with nature, which is very different to the earlier works we saw. And if we look at David Stevenson's work, he's American artist based in Tasmania for quite some time now. And he talks about the photographic sublime as a record of the infinite and transcendent in the natural and built world. So his work has focused on the aesthetics of environmental representation through photography and video art. And he also has this quite extended project where he's explored cosmological and technological manifestations of sublime in subjects, including the Tasmanian environment, Antarctic landscapes, star-filled skies, gone into central Australia, this idea of sacred architecture. So his works are this marked by this idea of self-deliberation and these notions of the sublime and man's capacity to pass time. So what you have here is a long exposure of the sky, and he calls them star drawings. So these are stars, movements through the sky. So looking at the image, you wouldn't know that, but he's trying to capture something that you wouldn't just see by looking at the sky. So he explained in an interview in 1998, which is quite a different, some years apart from these photographs, My art has remained essentially spiritual. For more than 2 decades, I have been exploring a contemporary expression of the sublime, a transcendental experience of awe with the vast space of time and existence. So his star drawing projects started in 1995 and still continued. And they're the result of all night or multiple night exposures. So this idea of time and ancient stars, I guess, sort of making their mark on the film in a present moment. So it goes back to this idea of grandness and greatness. So this is the end of part 2. We're going to move on to part 3, which is landscape and nature, and then sort of wrap up some of those ideas we've mentioned. But again, if you have questions, do keep them for our tutorial session in not too long if you're watching this during the regular lecture time period.